Napoleon Bonaparte came closer to remaking the world than almost any single person in recorded history. At his peak, he controlled more of Europe than any ruler since the Romans. He rewrote legal codes, redrew borders, and humiliated every major power on the continent. Then, he lost everything. Not in one catastrophic moment, but through a chain of decisions that each made sense at the time, and each made the next disaster more likely. This is how the most capable military mind of his era systematically destroyed himself. Selling Louisiana instead of building an empire in the West. In 1803, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for roughly $15 million, handing America 800,000 square miles in a single transaction. At the time, it looked like cold pragmatism. Saint-Domingue, his intended base for a Western empire, had just collapsed into the most successful slave rebellion in history. Thousands of French soldiers were dead from yellow fever and Haitian resistance. Holding Louisiana without a Caribbean anchor seemed impossible, and war with Britain was coming again. The money would fund that war. The logic was clean. What Napoleon gave away was the geographic foundation for a rival power that would eventually dwarf every European empire combined. He handed the United States the interior of a continent and turned a weak coastal republic into something that would one day make European dominance irrelevant. He needed cash for a war he was about to start. He funded it by creating the country that would eventually end European supremacy forever, crowning himself emperor and making every monarchy in Europe his enemy. In December 1804, Napoleon placed the crown on his own head inside Notre Dame Cathedral, with the Pope sitting nearby as a dignified prop. He wanted legitimacy. He had risen from Corsican obscurity and needed the symbolism of ancient power wrapped around his new regime. Making himself emperor seemed like the logical culmination of everything he had built. Kings had crowns. He would have one too. What it actually did was confirm every fear every European monarch had been quietly nursing. He was not a general who had gotten lucky. He was not a temporary disruption. He was a direct challenge to the entire principle that royal blood determined who ruled. Every throne in Europe now had a personal reason to see him destroyed. The coalitions that formed against him after 1804 were not just military alliances. They were existential. He had made it personal for every crowned head on the continent. The continental system that strangled his own allies. After defeating Prussia and Russia at Jena and Friedland, Napoleon imposed the continental system in 1806, a total embargo designed to strangle British trade by closing every European port to British goods. Britain controlled the seas after Trafalgar. He could not beat them with ships, so he would beat them with economics. Cutting off their exports would collapse their economy and force them to the table. The theory was reasonable. The practice was a slow catastrophe. European merchants, including those in countries Napoleon needed as loyal partners, watched their trade routes die. Goods rotted in warehouses. Neutral nations were forced to choose sides or be treated as enemies. Portugal refused to comply. Napoleon invaded. Spain became the entry point for British goods anyway, and Napoleon's attempt to fix that problem opened the wound that would bleed him for 6 years. The system that was supposed to defeat Britain without a navy instead gave him a war in Spain he could never win, and allies who resented him more every year it continued, putting his brother on the Spanish throne. In 1808, Napoleon removed the Spanish Bourbon king, forced a humiliating abdication at Bayonne, and installed his brother Joseph as King of Spain. He had done the same thing elsewhere, and it had worked. Installing family members on conquered thrones was his standard operating procedure. Spain was poorly governed, its monarchy was weak and unpopular, and French administration would be an improvement. He genuinely believed the Spanish people would accept it within months. Instead, he got the Peninsular War, 6 years of grinding guerrilla conflict that consumed somewhere between 300,000 and 375,000 French soldiers. The Spanish did not want efficient French administration. They wanted their own king, their own church, and their own country. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, entered the European vocabulary because of what happened next. Wellington used Spain as the anvil on which he slowly broke French military strength in the West, while Napoleon was distracted by everything else. Napoleon himself called it his Spanish ulcer. It never healed. Divorcing Josephine and marrying into the Austrian royal family. By 1809, Napoleon had no legitimate heir and a dynastic problem. He divorced Josephine, who had not produced a child, and married Marie-Louise of Austria, daughter of the Habsburg emperor he had defeated twice. The marriage would produce an heir, link him to the oldest royal family in Europe, and give his regime the legitimacy that birth alone could never provide. It was a rational calculation about political survival. What it cost him was his most important general principle, that he represented something new. He had built his entire political identity on the idea that talent and achievement mattered more than bloodline. Marrying into the Habsburgs told every ambitious Frenchman and every revolutionary sympathizer across Europe that he had become exactly what he had replaced. More practically, it gave Austria a reason to stay close and watch carefully. And when the moment came, Austria did not hesitate to turn on him. The father-in-law he had bought with a marriage helped bury him at Leipzig. Invading Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon crossed into Russia with roughly 600,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in European history to that point. Russia had been violating the continental system, allowing British trade through its ports. Letting that stand would unravel the entire embargo and signal that defiance of France carried no consequences. A massive, overwhelming show of force would bring Tsar Alexander to terms quickly. Previous campaigns had ended with a decisive battle and a negotiated peace. This would be the same. Russia simply refused to fight that kind of war. They retreated, burned their own cities, and let the Russian winter do the work. Napoleon took Moscow in September and found it on fire. He waited 5 weeks for a peace offer that never came. The retreat that followed killed his army, not through battle, but through cold, starvation, and Cossack raids on a column that stretched across hundreds of miles of frozen nothing. Fewer than 100,000 men returned in any fighting condition. He had walked the greatest army in the world into a country that swallowed it whole. Refusing reasonable peace terms in 1813. After Russia, the coalition came back stronger than ever. At the Congress of Prague in the summer of 1813, Austria offered Napoleon terms that would have left him with France, Belgium, and a significant portion of his influence. It was not the empire he had built, but it was a France larger than any Bourbon king had ruled. Metternich reportedly told him directly that this was the best offer he would ever receive. Napoleon stalled, negotiated without sincerity, and let the deadline pass. He believed he could still win militarily. He had rebuilt an army from almost nothing after Russia, which was a genuine military miracle, and he had won engagements that summer that suggested his touch had not left him. He could not accept that the strategic situation had permanently shifted against him. By the time he was ready to negotiate seriously, the terms on the table were France's original borders and nothing more. He had traded a survivable empire for a corner of Europe. Then he lost that too. The 100 Days and Waterloo. After his exile to Elba, Napoleon escaped in March 1815, landed in southern France, and marched to Paris while the army sent to stop him joined him instead. The restored Bourbon monarchy collapsed without a fight. It was one of the most audacious political comebacks in history, and it almost worked. He had correctly read that the French army still loved him, and that the Bourbon restoration was deeply unpopular. The calculation that he could return to power was not insane. What he could not account for was the speed and unity of the coalition's response, and what happened on the afternoon of June 18th at Waterloo. The Prussians arrived at the critical moment. His gamble on defeating Wellington before Prussian reinforcements arrived failed by hours. He was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, so far from Europe that escape was genuinely impossible. He died there in 1821, either from stomach cancer or, as some historians have argued, slow arsenic poisoning from the damp wallpaper in his rooms. The man who had remade Europe died slowly on a rock in the middle of the ocean, dictating his memoirs and rewriting his own legend for a world that had moved on without him. Every one of these decisions followed from the one before it. Each mistake created the pressure that made the next one feel necessary. He did not collapse because he was reckless. He collapsed because he was trapped inside a logic of his own making, and he never found a way out.